The struggling waitress paid for a homeless man's meal, unaware he was a billionaire in disguise, watching quietly from the corner booth of Maggie's diner as rain lashed against the windows. Her name tag read Sarah, but customers rarely bothered to look at it, seeing only a pair of hands delivering plates rather than the woman who carried the weight of 3 unpaid bills in her pocket and a silent phone that hadn't rung with news of her mother's health in days. Sarah Morgan wiped condensation from her brow with the back of her wrist, balancing 3 plates along her forearm with the practiced precision of someone who had spent far too many years serving others while putting her own dreams on hold. The dinner rush had finally quieted, leaving only the rhythmic drumming of raindrops against glass and the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic. Her feet ached inside worn sneakers, the soles thin enough that she could feel every imperfection in the cracked linoleum floor. She'd been on the double shift since 6 a.m., the sunrise barely breaking through storm clouds when she'd unlocked the diner's front door. Now, 14 hours later, the October night pressed black against the windows, and her tips barely covered half of what she needed for her mother's medication. "Order up," Hector called from the kitchen, sliding a steaming plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes onto the pass-through counter. The head cook's voice carried no impatience, only the gentle understanding of someone who had watched Sarah grow from a teenage girl bussing tables after school to a 28-year-old woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. "Thanks, Hector." Sarah tucked a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear and reached for the plate, her slender fingers curling around its warm edge. "Last one for the night?" Hector nodded, his salt and pepper mustache twitching with a small smile. "Last one. Then you go home and get some rest, yeah? You look dead on your feet, mija." Sarah managed a tired nod, knowing there would be little rest waiting for her in the small apartment she shared with her mother. Only medication schedules, insurance forms, and the constant fear that one missed payment would bring their careful balancing act crashing down around them. She carried the plate across the diner, her attention drawn to a figure huddled in the far corner booth. The man had slipped in during the worst of the downpour, his beard matted, clothes soaked through, looking like he carried the storm inside him. He'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, nursing a single cup of coffee that Dan, the evening manager, had grudgingly allowed him to order. Sarah placed the meatloaf in front of an elderly regular who nodded his thanks without looking up from his crossword puzzle. Then, almost without thinking, she found herself drifting toward the homeless man's table. Something about the way he sat, shoulders curved inward as if to take up less space, eyes downcast, fingers tracing idle patterns in the condensation on his coffee cup, tugged at her heart. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. She should be urging him to leave. Dan would be making closing announcements soon. The man looked up, and Sarah found herself caught in the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen. They seemed out of place in his weathered face, bright with an intelligence that contradicted his ragged appearance. "I'm fine, thank you." His voice was soft, cultured even, another contradiction. "Just waiting out the rain." Sarah glanced out the window where water still streamed down in silver ribbons, then back at the man whose clothes would take hours to dry even after the storm passed. An uncomfortable knot formed in her stomach. She recognized hunger when she saw it, had felt it herself often enough during the lean months after her father left and before she was old enough to work. "Would you like something to eat?" The words left her mouth before she could reconsider. A flicker of something, pride perhaps or shame, crossed his face. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't accept charity." Sarah bit her lower lip, considering. Behind her, she could hear Dan beginning to count out the register, the familiar ritual that signaled the end of another long day. In 20 minutes, they'd be locking the doors. "It's not charity," she said finally. "The kitchen always makes too much meatloaf on Thursdays. It'll just go to waste." The lie felt strangely right on her tongue, a small mercy that preserved his dignity. The man studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for the truth behind her words. Finally, his shoulders relaxed slightly. "If it's going to waste anyway, I wouldn't want to see good food thrown out. I'll be right back." Sarah turned before he could see the relief in her expression and hurried to the kitchen. "Hector, can I get one more meatloaf plate? To go?" The cook raised a bushy eyebrow but asked no questions as he assembled the plate. Sarah watched him pile on extra mashed potatoes and add a slice of apple pie that hadn't been requested, and her affection for the man who had been more of a father figure than her own dad swelled in her chest. When she returned to the booth with the styrofoam container, the man's eyes widened slightly at the generous portions. "This is very kind," he murmured. "It's nothing," Sarah replied, though they both knew it wasn't nothing. It was $12.95 plus tax that would come from her own pocket once Dan finished tallying the night's receipts. $12 that should have gone toward her mother's medicine or the electricity bill that had arrived in a threatening red envelope. The man opened the container and breathed in the steam that rose from the food. "May I ask your name?" he inquired, looking up at her with those disconcerting blue eyes. "Sarah," she answered, resisting the urge to touch her name tag. "Thank you, Sarah." He said her name carefully, as if it were something precious. "I'm Michael." She nodded, suddenly aware of how long she'd been standing at his table. "Enjoy your meal, Michael. We close in 15 minutes, but take your time." As she walked away to finish her closing duties, Sarah felt his eyes following her. Not in the uncomfortable way some men watched, assessing, wanting, but with a curious intensity that made her feel as though he could see beyond her tired smile and worn uniform to the person she'd almost forgotten existed beneath the weight of responsibility. By the time she finished wiping down tables and refilling condiment bottles, Michael had eaten every bite of the meal. She watched from the corner of her eye as he carefully refolded the napkin and placed it in the empty container, each movement deliberate and respectful. When Dan announced closing time, Michael stood, gathering his few possessions, a battered backpack and what appeared to be a journal wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain. "Here," Sarah said impulsively, holding out a paper bag containing a muffin and banana she'd set aside for her own breakfast tomorrow. For later. Michael hesitated, then accepted the bag with a slight bow of his head. "Your kindness won't be forgotten," he said quietly. Something in his tone made Sarah shiver, though not unpleasantly. For a brief moment, she felt as if she stood at the edge of something vast and unknown, a turning point she couldn't yet understand. Then he was gone, slipping out into the rain that had finally lessened to a gentle patter against the pavement. Sarah watched his silhouette disappear into the darkness, wondering why her small act of generosity, one she'd performed countless times before, felt so significant tonight. Dan counted out her meager tips while she hung up her apron. "You paid for that homeless guy's dinner, didn't you?" he asked, not unkindly. Sarah nodded, bracing for the lecture about the diner's policy on handouts. Instead, Dan surprised her by adding a 20 to her tip envelope. "My dad was homeless for a while after he came back from Vietnam," he said gruffly. "Someone's kindness saved his life." Before she could respond, he turned away, busying himself with paperwork. The unexpected gesture brought a lump to Sarah's throat. $20 meant she could fill her mother's prescription tomorrow instead of asking for another extension. $20 meant one less night lying awake, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to enough. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets glistening under streetlights. Sarah pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders against the October chill and began the 20-minute walk to her apartment, too tired to wait for the bus that came infrequently this late. Her thoughts drifted to Michael, wondering if he had somewhere dry to sleep tonight. The weight of her own problems seemed to shift slightly as she considered his, a strange comfort in the knowledge that hardship was a burden shared by many, not a punishment designed solely for her. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the black sedan parked across from her apartment building, its polished surface reflecting the amber glow of streetlights, an unusual sight in her neighborhood, where most vehicles were at least a decade old and carrying the battle scars of city living. Sarah hesitated briefly before continuing to her building, too exhausted to indulge her curiosity. The familiar scent of antiseptic greeted her as she unlocked the apartment door. She moved quietly through the darkened living room, pausing at her mother's bedroom door to listen for the reassuring sound of steady breathing. The cancer had progressed slowly but relentlessly over the past year, stealing first her mother's energy, then her independence, and finally her role as the family caretaker. The reversal of their positions, daughter becoming caregiver, remained a painful adjustment for them both. "Sarah, is that you?" Her mother's voice, thin but alert, called from the darkness. "It's me, Mom." Sarah pushed the door open wider, silhouetted in the hallway light. "Did I wake you?" "No, I was just resting my eyes." The familiar lie brought a sad smile to Sarah's face as she moved to sit on the edge of the bed. Her mother's hand found hers, the skin paper-thin over prominent veins. "How was work?" "The usual." Sarah squeezed her mother's fingers gently. Mrs. Peterson complained about her eggs being too runny, then tipped 20% anyway. Hector made his famous meatloaf. Oh, and I got an extra 20 from Dan tonight. She didn't mention Michael. Some experiences felt too personal to share, even with her mother, or perhaps especially with her mother, who would worry about Sarah giving away money they could barely afford to spare. You should sleep, her mother said, her voice already drifting toward unconsciousness as the evening dose of pain medication took effect. You're working yourself too hard. I'll sleep soon, Sarah promised, leaning down to press a kiss to her mother's forehead. I love you more, came the mumbled reply, a cherished exchange from Sarah's childhood that had survived into their difficult present. In the kitchen, Sarah opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents before closing it again, her appetite gone. Instead, she took out the battered shoebox where she kept their medical bills and began the nightly ritual of sorting them into piles. Paid, partially paid, and the largest stack, still waiting. The extra 20 from Dan went into the prescription envelope, bringing it tantalizingly close to the amount needed. Sarah hesitated, then reached for the jar where she kept her emergency fund. $212 saved over 6 months of tucking away spare change, and the occasional larger bill when she could afford it. Money that was supposed to be untouchable except in the direst circumstances. Was this dire enough? The refill was due tomorrow, and her mother's pain had been worse lately without consistent medication. Sarah removed $30, completing the amount needed, and promised herself she would replace it from her next paycheck, though she had made that same promise the last 2 times she'd dipped into the emergency fund. As she prepared for bed, moving through her nighttime routine with mechanical efficiency, Sarah found her thoughts returning to Michael and his startling blue eyes. There had been something about him, a dignity that his circumstances couldn't diminish, a presence that commanded attention despite his efforts to remain unnoticed. She wondered if she would see him again, then dismissed the thought as unlikely. People drifted in and out of the diner all the time. Faces appeared once and never returned. Sleep claimed her quickly that night, her body too exhausted to allow her mind its usual anxious wandering. She dreamed of rain and warm food and a pair of blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the thin curtains and the persistent beeping of her alarm. Sarah silenced it with a practiced motion, allowing herself exactly 3 minutes to transition from sleep to wakefulness before rising to check on her mother and prepare for another day of double shifts. The apartment felt different somehow, quieter, as if holding its breath. Sarah padded to the kitchen in worn slippers, automatically reaching for the coffee pot before noticing the envelope that had been slipped under their front door. Her name was written across the front in elegant handwriting she didn't recognize. Frowning, she picked it up. The envelope was heavy, made of expensive cream-colored paper that felt strange between her fingers, accustomed to the rough texture of diner napkins and cheap bills. For a moment, she considered leaving it unopened, irrationally fearful of what it might contain. Bad news never came in expensive envelopes, but good news rarely came to her door at all. Finally, curiosity overcame caution. She slid her finger under the sealed flap and carefully extracted a single sheet of matching cream paper. The message was brief, written in the same elegant hand as her name. Kindness, freely given when most needed, deserves kindness in return. Please accept this with the same grace with which you offered your help last night. Michael. Beneath the note was a stack of crisp $100 bills. Sarah's hands began to tremble so violently that several bills fluttered to the floor. She sank into a kitchen chair, staring at the money as if it might vanish if she blinked. Carefully, hardly daring to breathe, she counted. $1,000 lay before her, more money than she typically earned in 2 weeks of exhausting double shifts. Her first coherent thought was that it must be a mistake. Her second was that the money might be counterfeit or somehow illegal. Her third, forming more slowly as the initial shock began to recede, was that Michael was clearly not the homeless man he had appeared to be. The struggling waitress paid for a homeless man's meal, unaware he was a billionaire in disguise. The phrase echoed in her mind like something from a fairy tale or an improbable headline, not something that happened in real life, and certainly not to someone like her. Yet the evidence lay before her, impossible to deny. Sarah's practical nature reasserted itself gradually. Whatever Michael's true circumstances, this money would pay for her mother's medication for months. It would keep their electricity on through the winter. It might even allow Sarah to reduce her hours slightly, giving her time to finally enroll in the community college nursing program she'd been dreaming of since her mother's diagnosis. Still, something held her back from immediately embracing this unexpected windfall. Pride, perhaps. Or the ingrained suspicion that anything too good to be true usually was. Or simply the unsettling feeling that accepting the money would connect her to Michael in ways she couldn't predict or control. The sound of her mother's coughing from the bedroom decided her. Questions and concerns could wait. Her mother's needs could not. Sarah carefully returned the money to the envelope and tucked it into her waitressing apron pocket. She would think about it during her shift, decide what to do with a clearer head. For now, she had medication to pick up and her mother's breakfast to prepare. The morning passed in its usual rush of activity, helping her mother bathe and dress, preparing a simple breakfast, organizing medications, making a quick call to the home health aide who would arrive mid-morning. Through it all, Sarah was acutely aware of the envelope in her pocket, its presence both a comfort and a distraction. "You seem different today," her mother observed as Sarah helped her settle into her favorite chair by the window. "Did something happen?" Sarah hesitated, then smiled. "Just feeling optimistic, I guess. The sun's out." Her mother studied her face with the perceptiveness that illness had sharpened rather than diminished. Well, whatever it is, it looks good on you. You've been carrying too much worry for too long," says the woman who raised me on her own while working 2 jobs. Sarah countered, kissing her mother's cheek. "I learned from the best." The home health aide arrived, bringing with her the comfortable chatter and competent hands that made her presence a relief rather than an intrusion. Sarah left for work with promises to return by 8, the weight of the envelope a constant reminder against her hip as she walked to the diner. Maggie's looked different in the morning light, less a haven and more a weathered establishment showing its age in faded upholstery and scratched countertops. Sarah tied her apron with practiced movements, nodding to the morning cook and the other waitress already bustling between tables. "You're looking chipper." Brenda, the 60-something waitress who had trained Sarah years ago, remarked as they passed each other at the coffee station. "Win the lottery?" The question, so close to her current situation, startled a laugh from Sarah. "Not exactly. Just had a decent night's sleep for once." The morning rush kept her too busy for much reflection, her body moving through the familiar choreography of taking orders, delivering food, refilling coffee, and calculating checks. Yet beneath the routine, her mind circled repeatedly back to the envelope, to Michael, to the impossible twist her life had taken in the space of 12 hours. By mid-morning, as the rush subsided and she found herself with a moment to breathe, Sarah had made a decision. She would use some of the money for her mother's immediate medical needs, but not all of it. The rest she would hold until she could somehow contact Michael, to thank him properly, yes, but also to understand. Why her? Why so much? And most puzzling of all, why the disguise? She was wiping down a recently vacated booth when the diner's bell chimed, announcing a new customer. Sarah looked up, a welcoming smile already forming on her lips, and froze. Michael stood in the doorway, but not the Michael from last night. This man wore a perfectly tailored gray suit that highlighted his athletic build, his beard was neatly trimmed, and his hair, now clean and styled, revealed strands of distinguished silver at the temples. Only those remarkable blue eyes remained unchanged, watching her with the same intensity she remembered. Sarah's hand tightened on her cleaning cloth as several patrons turned to stare at the newcomer, who seemed so out of place in the modest diner. She felt suddenly acutely aware of her worn uniform, the coffee stain on her apron, the wisps of hair escaping her hasty ponytail. Michael moved toward her with easy confidence, seeming not to notice the curious glances following him. When he reached her table, he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his voice the same gentle tone she remembered despite his transformed appearance. "May I join you for a coffee when you have a moment?" Sarah found her voice with effort. Yes, of course. I can take a break in about 15 minutes if that works for you." He nodded, sliding into the booth she had just cleaned. "I'll wait." Those 15 minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Sarah moved mechanically through her remaining tasks, hyper-aware of Michael's presence. He sat quietly, declining offers of breakfast from Brenda, his attention seemingly absorbed by the simple paper placemat before him. Yet Sarah could feel his awareness tracking her movements, patient but unwavering. Finally, she poured 2 cups of coffee and slid into the seat across from him, placing the envelope between them on the table. I think we need to talk about this, she said quietly. Michael's eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to her face. You haven't spent it yet. I needed to understand first. Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. Who are you, really? And why the performance last night? Something like respect flickered in his expression. Most people would have asked fewer questions and simply kept the money, he observed. I'm not most people, Sarah replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her tone. And you haven't answered my question. Michael leaned back slightly, studying her. My name is Michael Donovan. I'm the founder and CEO of Donovan Enterprises. And last night wasn't exactly a performance, though I understand why it might appear that way. Sarah's breath caught. Donovan Enterprises, the technology conglomerate whose headquarters dominated the city's skyline 20 blocks from her apartment. Everyone in the city knew the name, even if most had never seen the famously private man behind the company. She trailed off, struggling to reconcile the homeless man she'd fed with the billionaire sitting across from her. Wealthy? Yes, Michael acknowledged with a slight nod. But that doesn't make my gratitude for your kindness any less genuine. Sarah pushed the envelope toward him. I can't accept this. It's too much and it feels, I don't know, like I'm being rewarded for something that shouldn't need rewarding. Being decent to another human being isn't exceptional. But it is, Michael countered softly. More exceptional than you realize, especially when that decency comes at personal cost. You gave me that meal knowing you'd have to pay for it yourself. You gave me your own breakfast when you had no obligation to do so. He paused, his gaze intensifying. You showed compassion when many others would have seen only inconvenience. Sarah shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. That still doesn't explain why you were pretending to be homeless, or why you singled me out for whatever this is. She gestured at the envelope. Michael's expression sobered. I wasn't pretending, not entirely. 2 years ago, I was exactly where you saw me last night, homeless, hungry, with nothing but a backpack to my name. The quiet certainty in his voice silenced Sarah's skepticism. She waited, sensing there was more to the story. I lost everything, Michael continued, his fingers tracing an absent pattern on the table's surface. My wife died of cancer. I couldn't cope. The company I'd built from nothing began to falter without my leadership. I started drinking, making bad decisions. Within a year, I'd stepped down as CEO, alienated my board of directors, and walked away from my life. The parallels to her own situation, her mother's illness, the constant struggle to stay afloat, were not lost on Sarah. What changed? She asked softly. Someone like you. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, melancholy but genuine. A stranger who saw me as a person, not a problem. Who shared what little they had without judgment or expectation of return. It reminded me that connection, human kindness, is the only thing of real value in this world. He fell silent for a moment, his gaze turning inward as if revisiting that pivotal moment. I pulled myself together, went to rehab, fought my way back into my company, rebuilt everything I'd lost, except of course my wife. I'm sorry, Sarah murmured, understanding loss in a way she hadn't before her mother's diagnosis. Michael acknowledged her sympathy with a slight inclination of his head. Every year, on the anniversary of the day that stranger's kindness turned my life around, I go back to the streets. I spend 24 hours homeless again. It keeps me grounded, reminds me of what matters. And last night was that anniversary, Sarah realized. Yes, though I usually don't interact much with others during these remembrances. I simply observe, experience. But last night, the rain was worse than forecasted. I was genuinely cold hungry. I came in for coffee, intending to leave once the worst of the storm passed. His eyes held hers. Then you approached my table. Sarah recalled the moment, her exhaustion, the man with downcast eyes, the inexplicable compulsion she'd felt to offer him a meal. So all of this, she gestured at the envelope again, is because I happened to be working when you came in from the rain? No. Michael's response was immediate and firm. This is because when you looked at a wet, ragged stranger who could offer you nothing in return, you saw a human being worthy of dignity and kindness. Do you know how rare that is, Sarah? Do you understand what a gift you gave me? Not the food, but the acknowledgement of my humanity when I was at my lowest? The intensity in his voice made her throat tighten. Anyone would have done the same, she protested weakly. We both know that's not true. His smile held a touch of sadness. I've spent enough time on both sides of fortune to know how invisible those at the bottom can become. Sarah looked down at her coffee, now growing cold, struggling to process everything he'd shared. Even if I accept that explanation, $1,000 is still… It's too much. Not to me, Michael said simply, and not for what it represents. They fell silent. The ambient noise of the diner, clinking silverware, murmured conversations, the hiss of the grill, creating a strange bubble of privacy around their booth. Sarah found herself studying Michael's face, noting the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of past sorrows and the determined set of his jaw that suggested how he might have fought his way back from rock bottom. "My mother has cancer," she said finally, the words emerging unbidden. "Stage 3? The treatments are expensive, even with insurance. I've been working double shifts for almost a year trying to keep up with the bills." Michael's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. Cancer is a cruel adversary. I watched it take my Elizabeth inch by inch. That's why I can't just accept this money as some kind of reward for basic human decency. But I also can't pretend we don't desperately need it." Sarah pulled the envelope back toward her, conflicted. "It feels wrong somehow." "Then don't think of it as a reward," Michael suggested. "Think of it as one human being helping another, just as you helped me. The fact that I can offer more substantial help than a meal doesn't change the nature of the gesture." Sarah considered his words, finding a certain logic in them that eased her discomfort. Still, something nagged at her. Why not just make a donation to cancer research or set up a fund for patients struggling with medical bills? Why single me out? Michael tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Those are worthy causes and ones I support regularly, but they're abstract, impersonal. What you gave me wasn't a donation to a nameless charity. It was direct human connection at a moment when I needed it most." He paused. "Though if it would make you more comfortable, I could structure this differently." "What do you mean?" "Donovan Enterprises has a foundation that provides educational scholarships for promising students facing financial hardship. We could arrange for you to receive one, allowing you to pursue your own education while continuing to care for your mother." Sarah blinked in surprise. "How did you know I wanted to go back to school?" A hint of sheepishness crossed Michael's face. "I may have made some inquiries about you after our encounter last night. Nothing invasive," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just enough to understand who had shown me such kindness." Under normal circumstances, Sarah might have found this disturbing, a stranger investigating her life overnight. But there was nothing normal about this situation, and something in Michael's manner suggested his interest came from genuine appreciation rather than anything more concerning. "Nursing," she admitted after a moment. "I've wanted to study nursing since Mom got sick. Seeing how much difference good care makes?" She trailed off, suddenly aware of how much she was revealing to someone who was still, essentially, a stranger, albeit an extraordinarily generous one. "A scholarship would cover your tuition and provide a stipend for living expenses," Michael said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. "It would be awarded on merit. Your academic record from high school is quite impressive despite your circumstances, and would require you to maintain a certain GPA. No one would view it as charity." The offer tempted her more than the simple cash gift had. A legitimate scholarship would preserve her pride while providing the practical support her family desperately needed. "That sounds more manageable," she acknowledged. "But why go to all that trouble for someone you just met?" Michael's expression softened again. "Because 18 months ago I made a promise to myself. I promised that if I ever found my way back to stability, I would honor the kindness that saved me by extending that same kindness to others. Your gesture last night, it was like looking into a mirror of my own redemption story." He paused. "Besides, investing in someone with your work ethic and compassion isn't trouble. It's simply good sense." Sarah couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "You make it sound so reasonable when you put it that way." "It is reasonable," Michael insisted gently. "Allow me to help you the way someone once helped me. Not with a handout, but with an opportunity. A chance to build the life you've put on hold while caring for others." The sincerity in his voice was impossible to doubt. Sarah found herself nodding slowly, the weight she'd carried for so long beginning to lift slightly. "All right. If you're serious about the scholarship, I'd be grateful to accept." The smile that transformed Michael's face made him look years younger. "Excellent. I'll have my foundation director contact you with the details. In the meantime," he pushed the envelope back toward her, "consider this in advance. For immediate needs." Sarah hesitated only briefly before tucking the envelope back into her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the emotions swirling within her. Relief, gratitude, and something that felt suspiciously like hope. "No, Sarah." "Thank you." Michael's voice had returned to the gentle tone she remembered from the night before, for reminding a cynical old man that kindness still exists in unexpected places. Their coffee had grown cold, but neither seemed to notice as they continued talking. Michael shared stories of his early days building his company, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned about what truly mattered in life. Sarah found herself opening up about her mother, her dreams of becoming a nurse, and the small joys she found even in her most difficult days. When Brenda finally approached to inform Sarah that her break had extended well beyond 15 minutes, Michael apologized and insisted on compensating the diner for her time. "After all," he said with a wink as he laid several large bills on the table, "I've monopolized their best waitress." Before leaving, he handed Sarah a business card with his personal number written on the back. "For any questions about the scholarship," he explained, "or if you and your mother need anything at all." Sarah watched him go, the elegant figure in his tailored suit drawing curious glances as he exited the diner. The morning sun caught him in its glow for a moment, transforming him into something almost mythical before the door closed behind him. "So," Brenda sidled up beside her, eyes wide with curiosity, "you gonna tell me what that was all about, or do I have to die of suspense right here next to the ketchup dispensers?" Sarah tucked the business card carefully into her pocket alongside the envelope. "Would you believe me if I said he was a homeless man I fed last night who turned out to be a billionaire in disguise?" Brenda snorted. "Girl, I've been working diners for 40 years. I've heard every story there is, but that one might take the cake." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "Though from the look of you, I'm thinking it might actually be true. Sometimes life is stranger than fiction." Sarah replied with a small smile, picking up her coffee pot and returning to work with lighter steps than she'd managed in months. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life transformed with a speed that left her breathless. True to his word, Michael arranged a full scholarship through his foundation, complete with a living stipend generous enough that Sarah could reduce her hours at the diner to part-time while she began nursing classes at the local community college. More surprising was how Michael himself became a regular presence in her life. He visited the diner weekly, always sitting in the same corner booth, always leaving extravagant tips that he insisted be shared among all the staff. He inquired after Sarah's mother with genuine concern, eventually arranging for her to see specialists at the city's premier cancer center, a perk of knowing people on the board. He explained casually when Sarah protested the extraordinary favor. Hector dubbed him Sarah's guardian angel, a nickname that made her blush but wasn't entirely inaccurate. Michael never overstepped, never made her feel like a charity case, but his steady support created a safety net that allowed her to focus on her studies and her mother's care without the crushing anxiety that had been her constant companion for so long. Her mother, initially suspicious of Michael's sudden appearance in their lives, gradually warmed to him after he visited their apartment bearing homemade soup. "Elizabeth's recipe," he explained quietly, and spent an afternoon sharing stories that made her laugh for the first time in months. "He's lonely," her mother observed after one such visit. "All that money, all that success, and he's searching for connection just like the rest of us." Sarah had never thought of Michael, confident, composed Michael with his empire and influence, as lonely. But watching him as he insisted on washing their dinner dishes, she recognized the truth in her mother's words. For all his generosity toward them, she began to suspect they were giving him something equally valuable in return. Family, normalcy, a place where he was valued for himself rather than his wealth or position. Spring arrived, bringing with it cautiously optimistic reports from her mother's doctors. The new treatment protocol was showing promising results, not a cure, but precious time and improved quality of life. Sarah excelled in her nursing courses, her practical experience caring for her mother giving her advantages her younger classmates lacked. One evening in April, as cherry blossoms drifted like pink snow across the city, Michael invited Sarah to dinner at his penthouse apartment. "Nothing fancy?" he assured her. "Just home-cooked food and some news I'd like to share?" She arrived to find him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up as he stirred something that filled the spacious apartment with mouth-watering aromas. The penthouse itself was surprisingly modest for a man of his wealth, comfortable rather than ostentatious, with worn leather furniture and bookshelves that looked actually red rather than staged for effect. "I hope you like risotto," Michael said by way of greeting. "It's one of the few dishes I can make without embarrassing myself." It smells amazing." Sarah set down the small potted plant she'd brought as a hostess gift, a habit her mother had instilled in her, and moved to the kitchen island. "Can I help? You can pour the wine." Michael nodded toward an open bottle. "And then tell me how your pharmacology exam went. You were worried about it last week." The easy domesticity of the scene struck Sarah suddenly. How natural it felt to be here in this space with him, discussing her day as if they'd known each other for years instead of months. In many ways, they had become an unlikely family of sorts. The billionaire, the waitress turned nursing student, and her ailing mother, bound together by a chance encounter and a simple act of kindness that had rippled outward with unexpected consequences. Over dinner, served at a table set with simple elegance, Michael seemed uncharacteristically nervous. He asked about her classes, her mother, her plans for the summer, but with a distracted quality that suggested his mind was elsewhere. Finally, as they lingered over dessert, store-bought tiramisu that he admitted sheepishly he'd claimed as homemade, Michael set down his fork with deliberate care. "I mentioned I had news to share." Sarah nodded, curious about whatever could make this self-assured man fidget like a schoolboy. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," he began, his voice thoughtful. "About what we leave behind, how we're remembered. Elizabeth and I never had children. Her cancer came early in our marriage, and by the time we considered other options, she was already ill again." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Donovan Enterprises has been my life's work, my legacy. But lately I've been wondering if it's enough. From what I understand, your company has revolutionized clean energy technology," Sarah said gently. "That seems like a pretty significant legacy." Michael smiled, acknowledging her point with a slight nod. "True. But companies change. Technologies evolve or become obsolete. I'm more interested now in the human legacy, the lives we touch, the differences we make person to person." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Meeting you that night, it changed something for me, Sarah. Reminded me what matters most. And I've made a decision I wanted to share with you first before it becomes public." Sarah waited, suddenly breathless with anticipation, though she couldn't have explained why. "I'm establishing a new foundation, the Elizabeth Donovan Second Chance Foundation. It will identify people who are struggling but showing extraordinary character and resilience, people like you, and provide them with the resources to transform their lives and communities." The passion in his voice was captivating, his blue eyes alight with purpose. "I'm seeding it with $1 billion of my personal fortune, not corporate funds, my own. And I'd like you to be involved if you're willing." Sarah blinked, processing his words slowly. "Involved how?" "Initially as a scholarship recipient who can speak to the impact of such opportunities. Eventually, perhaps in a more formal capacity once you've completed your nursing degree." Michael leaned forward slightly. "You have a gift, Sarah. You see people, truly see them, when others look past. That's exactly the quality this foundation needs to identify those deserving of support." Warmth spread through Sarah's chest at his words, a sense of rightness she couldn't quite articulate. "I'd be honored," she said simply, "though I'm not sure what I could contribute beyond my own story." "Your story is powerful precisely because it's still being written," Michael replied. "You're not a finished success tale, you're in the messy middle of transformation. That authenticity will resonate with others facing similar challenges." They talked long into the evening, Michael outlining his vision for the foundation, while Sarah offered insights from her perspective, practical considerations about healthcare costs, educational barriers, and the logistics of working while studying that someone of Michael's wealth might never have encountered directly. As the night grew late and Sarah prepared to leave, Michael walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for tonight, but for everything since that rainy evening. For showing kindness to a stranger, for accepting help with grace, for allowing me into your life." Something in his tone made Sarah turn to face him fully. In the soft lighting of his entryway, Michael looked suddenly vulnerable, the powerful CEO momentarily set aside to reveal the man beneath, a man who had lost everything once and found his way back through the compassion of others. "I should be thanking you," she countered softly. "You've changed our lives in ways I never could have imagined." Michael shook his head slightly. "That's the beautiful paradox of kindness, isn't it? It's impossible to determine who benefits more, the giver or the receiver. In the end, perhaps it doesn't matter. As Sarah made her way home that night, the city lights reflecting on rain-slicked streets, much as they had the night she first met Michael, she contemplated how profoundly her life had changed in 6 short months. From desperate exhaustion to cautious hope, from isolation to connection, from merely surviving to beginning, finally, to thrive. The struggling waitress had paid for a homeless man's meal, unaware he was a billionaire in disguise. But the true disguise, she now understood, had been the armor she herself had worn for so long, the brave face that hid her fear, the cheerful efficiency that masked her despair, the stubborn independence that kept others at a distance lest they see how close to breaking she had come. Michael's disguise had been deliberate, hers had been unconscious. Yet both had fallen away in the simple human exchange of one person seeing another's need and responding with kindness. And in that moment of authentic connection, something rare and precious had been born, something that would go on to touch countless lives through the foundation they would build together. As the taxi pulled up to her apartment building, Sarah noticed a single light burning in her mother's window. Even now, no matter how late Sarah worked, her mother kept watch, a beacon guiding her home. Some forms of love, she reflected, required no disguise at all. They simply endured, steadfast and true, illuminating the darkness for all who needed their light. And that perhaps was the greatest legacy any of us could hope to leave behind.